Chapter 4. Bound by Law. "Stop!" roared Captain Stevens, striding across the grass. He yelled something in Abenaki. Isaac pulled himself off the older boy and stood up. "What happened?" Captain Stevens asked angrily. "That savage just came at me," Ezekiel charged. "I wasn't doing nothing." Captain Stevens looked around at the group of children clustered near the woodpile. News of the fate had traveled fast in the small fort, and more than a dozen children had now gathered in the grassy area. Rebecca saw her sister among the group. Celinda looked pale and worried. "Is that true?" Captain Stevens asked the assembled children. A few minutes before, several of the boys had been cheering loudly for Ezekiel. Now the whole group was silent under Captain Stevens' stern eye. "Did Isaac start the fight?" the captain demanded. Rebecca hesitated, but Celinda stepped forward. "No," she said quietly. "Ezekiel started it." Captain Stevens looked at Ezekiel, who was bloody from the pounding he'd received. "I hope you learned a lesson," he told the red-headed boy. Then the captain said something in Abenaki. Isaac picked up his shirt and stalked back to Widow Tyler's cabin. The captain watched Isaac go. Then he turned to the assembled children. "I'm leaving the fort now, but I'll be back in a few days. There shall be no trouble while I'm gone. Do ye understand?" Everyone nodded. Ezekiel looked down at his feet. "If anyone starts another fight, he'll be seriously punished. I'll see to it myself," the captain continued. He looked through the palisades to the dark forested hills beyond the fort. "We have enemies all around us. We don't need to be fighting among ourselves, too." The captain turned away and headed toward Widow Tyler's back door. He let himself in, strode quickly through the cabin, and then walked out the front door into the yard. Rebecca hurried after him. As she passed through the cabin, she saw that the widow was still asleep and that Isaac had pulled the curtain shut around his bed. "Captain Stevens!" Rebecca called when she reached the yard, but the fort's commander was so wrapped up in his own thoughts that he didn't hear her. He had just reached the south gate when Rebecca caught up to him. "Excuse me, sir. Did you speak with Mrs. Cutter?" I'd come to the widow's cabin to tell you about it, but then I saw the fight," the captain said, frowning. "Mrs. Cutter's determined to leave, and take your sister with her." "She can't." "She is within her rights," Captain Stevens replied sternly. Then he looked into Rebecca's eyes, and his tone softened. "I must go now, but I'll try to talk with Mrs. Cutter again when I return." "That may be too late," Rebecca wanted to cry out, but the words choked in her throat. "Yes, sir," she said. The sentry opened the south gate, and Rebecca saw 5 of Captain Stevens' men assembled on horseback just outside the fort. One of the men held Scoggin, the captain's horse. The captain jumped on Scoggin and rode away with his men. As the gate closed behind the men, Rebecca felt very much alone. She walked slowly back toward Widow Tyler's cabin. She found Ezekiel and Celinda standing in front of the cabin. Ezekiel was glaring down at the younger girl. "You had to defend that Indian, didn't you?" he accused her. "You'll see where that gets you." "Don't you threaten my sister," Rebecca burst out, "Or you'll what?" Ezekiel asked. He wiped his blood-stained face. "Your sister belongs to my family now." He turned to Celinda. "Get back to our house. After I wash up, I'll tell my mother how you lied and made trouble for me." Rebecca watched forlornly as Celinda followed Ezekiel back across the yard. Celinda entered the Cutter's cabin, but Ezekiel went to the well to wash the blood and dirt off his face. "I must talk to Mrs. Cutter," Rebecca decided, "and I'd better do it now before Ezekiel poisons her mind against us." She took a deep breath. She dreaded the thought of calling on Mrs. Cutter, but she remembered how her father used to say, "Do the worst job first, then the rest will all seem easy." She forced herself to cross the yard and knock at the Cutter's door. Mrs. Cutter opened it a crack. She was a tall woman with cold blue eyes and a jutting chin like her son's. "Begging your pardon, ma'am, may I speak to you?" Rebecca asked. "If it's about Celinda, you're wasting your time," Mrs. Cutter said sharply. "As I told Captain Stevens, a contract is a contract. I've paid for a full year of Celinda's labor, and she will come with us." Rebecca's hope sank, yet she continued, "Please, ma'am, may I come in? Just for a moment?" Mrs. Cutter opened the door. "Very well, but only a moment. I have much to do." Rebecca followed Mrs. Cutter inside. The cabin smelled of lye soap, and damp dresses and bed covers hung from the rafters. A dozen or more brightly colored hair ribbons, all freshly washed, fluttered in the breeze by the window. Celinda was in the corner pinning a dress onto Priscilla Cutter. The material was colored the bright blue of a robin's egg, and the dress was cut in the style all the ladies in Boston were wearing. Celinda smiled up at her sister, her mouth filled with pins. Mrs. Cutter frowned. "Celinda, go outside and turn the quilts. See that they dry evenly." "Celinda must finish this dress, Mamma," Priscilla complained, "or I shall have nothing to wear in Connecticut." She will finish it later, dear, Mrs. Cutter said firmly. Celinda, do as I say. I want to speak to your sister in private. As soon as Celinda left, Mrs. Cutter turned toward Rebecca. Well? Ma'am, Rebecca blurted out, please don't take Celinda with you. She explained to Mrs. Cutter how important it was that she and Celinda stay together. Since our parents and Benjamin were taken, all we've had is each other. A contract is a contract, Mrs. Cutter repeated briskly. If you cannot buy back your sister's contract, then you must accept that she is leaving with us. Rebecca felt her anger rising, but she forced herself to ask humbly, if Celinda must go with you, then may I come too? I'd be sorry to leave Widow Tyler, but I'd go if it meant that Celinda and I would not be parted. Rebecca saw a glimmer of interest in Mrs. Cutter's eyes when she added, I'd work for free. All I'd need is bed and board. Before Mrs. Cutter could answer, Ezekiel walked into the house. His face was clean now, but a fresh bruise blackened his forehead. Don't listen to her, Mother, he declared. She wants to make trouble. Mrs. Cutter scowled at her son. What happened to you? That savage boy attacked me, Ezekiel claimed, with a look of injured innocence. And she, he pointed at Rebecca, and her sister told Captain Stevens that it was my fault. That's not true, Rebecca protested. Mrs. Cutter eyed Rebecca disapprovingly. It's clear you're a bad influence on Celinda. She'll be better off without you. In fact, I'm probably doing her a favor by taking her with us. Rebecca's anger burst out. Doing her a favor, she exclaimed. She gestured at the finery hanging in the house. You don't give a fig about my sister. All you care about are dresses and hair ribbons and what style Celinda can sew for you. Your sister is coming with me whether you like it or not, Mrs. Cutter said icily. She pointed at the door. Now leave this house and don't come back. Rebecca walked slowly across the dusty yard back to the widow's house. When she entered the cabin, she saw Isaac sitting cross-legged on his bed. He was whittling a heavy stick with a knife that had once belonged to Widow Tyler's husband. Usually the knife hung by the fireplace. Rebecca was annoyed that Isaac had taken it down. He just helps himself to whatever he wants, she thought. She turned on the savage boy. Why did you fight with Ezekiel? Celinda works for his family. You've made things worse for her. Isaac looked up from his whittling. He fight. He paused and touched his ear. It was still bloody. Me fight. Rebecca knew he was right. Ezekiel had started the fight. Isaac had only defended himself. But she was still angry. You didn't have to beat him that hard, she persisted. You could have killed him. Isaac did not reply. He returned to his whittling. Rebecca was sure that this savage boy understood much more English than he admitted. Killed, she repeated loudly. You could have killed him. No kill, Isaac said quietly. Suddenly he drew back his arm. With a flick of his wrist, he sent the hunting knife sailing across the room. It skewered an apple ring, then dug itself deeply into a rafter of the ceiling. Isaac stood up and retrieved the knife. Then he returned to his seat on the bed and picked up his whittling again. He expertly shaved a thin white slice of wood from the heavy stick in his hands. Rebecca stared at him, and he looked up at her, his eyes tight angry slits. No kill, he repeated. Rebecca felt a cold twist of fear in her stomach. He's telling me that he could have killed Ezekiel, but he chose not to, she realized. I wonder if he hates us all.